My manager wanted aggressive deadlines at any cost. So I gave him exactly what he asked for. If he wanted to play games with our lives, I was going to make sure the price was high enough to bankrupt him. This is how a simple act of professional sabotage turned into a corporate execution. I used to think that hard work was the currency of respect. I believed that if I stayed late, if I documented every bug, and if I anticipated every possible complication before my manager could even ask about them, I would eventually earn a seat at the table. I thought that being reliable meant being safe. But in the corporate world, reliability isn't a virtue to them. It is an invitation for exploitation. My name is Elias, and for 3 years, I was the lead developer for a mid-sized software firm called NexusStream. We weren't giants, but we were profitable enough to have those soul-crushing management layers that exist only to monitor people who are already doing their jobs perfectly. My direct supervisor was a man named Marcus. Marcus didn't know how to write a single line of code, but he was a master of the PowerPoint presentation. He knew exactly how to take a complex technical roadmap and turn it into a series of optimistic, colorful slides that made investors salivate. The trouble started during the rollout of Project Ethelgard. It was our biggest contract ever. A massive infrastructure overhaul for a global logistics firm. The scale of it was staggering. To do it right, to build something stable and scalable, my team needed 18 months. We had calculated every dependency, every testing phase, and every integration requirement. We presented these numbers to Marcus, expecting him to advocate for us. Marcus looked at our 18-month roadmap, glanced at his monitor, and then looked back at me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He told me that the stakeholders didn't want irrealistic. They wanted an aggressive, he said. If we went in with 18 months, the competition would eat us alive before we even launched. He told me that my job was to provide him with a number he could sell. Then he leaned in closer and whispered that if I could give him a timeline that looked more like 12 months, there would be significant bonuses tied to the early delivery. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. 12 months wasn't just ambitious. It was mathematically impossible without cutting corners that would eventually cause the entire system to collapse under its own weight. But Marcus didn't care about stability. He cared about his quarterly performance review. Over the next month, the pressure became a physical weight. Every time I brought up technical debt or security protocols, Marcus dismissed me. He called me cautious and told me I lacked a growth mindset. It was corporate shorthand for stop being difficult and give me what I want. That was when the rage started to simmer. It wasn't a sudden explosion, it was a slow burn, like an ember glowing in the dark. I realized that my honesty was actually working against me. By being honest about how long things took, I was making myself a target for more work. If I told them something would take 3 months, and it took 3 months, they rewarded me with more projects. If I told them something would take 6 months, and it took 4, I was a hero. But if I told them something would take 12 months, and they wanted it in 8, I was the problem. So I decided to change my strategy. If they wanted numbers that were easy to sell, I would give them numbers that were impossible to live with. But I wouldn't do it by lying about the work itself. I would do it by padding every single task by exactly 6 months. It felt strange at first. It felt like a betrayal of my professional integrity. But then I remembered the weekend I spent working through my daughter's birthday because Marcus said we had an emergency that was actually just a minor UI tweak he forgot to schedule. I remembered the burnout, the gray hairs appearing in my temples, and the way they looked at us, not as human beings with lives and families and limits, but as line items on a budget. I started small. A task that should have taken 2 weeks, I estimated it as 8 weeks due to unforeseen integration complexities. A module that required 3 months of heavy lifting. I listed it as 9 months to allow for rigorous stress testing and edge case validation. Whenever Marcus asked why the estimates were so high, I had a prepared defense. I used all their buzzwords. I talked about mitigation strategies, risk assessment buffers, and contingency windows for legacy system compatibility. I spoke their language so fluently that they couldn't find a way to argue with me without sounding like they didn't understand the technical risks themselves. The madness of it was that it worked perfectly. Because my estimates were so padded, we always beat our deadlines. We would finish the task in 2 months, but since I had estimated 8, we spent the remaining 6 months doing actual, high-quality work, cleaning up code, and, most importantly, not working overtime. For the first time in years, I was going home at 5 o'clock. I was playing football with my son. I was sleeping through the night. I felt like a spy behind enemy lines. Every time Marcus walked past my desk to brag about how on track we were, I had to keep my face perfectly neutral. I became an expert in the art of the calm, professional nod. But as Project Ethelgard moved from planning into development, the stakes grew higher. The client, the global logistics firm, was not a passive observer. They were demanding monthly progress reports. They weren't just looking at our internal milestones. They were looking at the actual velocity of code being pushed to their staging environments. This is where the plan became dangerous. I couldn't just sit around for 6 months on every task anymore. If we showed 0 progress, the client would pull the contract and Marcus would be out of a job. I had to master the art of a simulated progress. We would release small, incremental updates that looked impressive but were actually just superficial layers. We were building a beautiful, shiny house on top of a foundation that was still being poured very, very slowly. The tension in my chest grew every day. I knew that eventually the math wouldn't add up. Eventually, the reality of the work would collide with the fantasy we had sold to the investors. I started wondering if I should stop. Maybe I could just go back to being the cautious guy and accept my fate as a corporate martyr. But then, Marcus called me into his office for a celebratory lunch. He told me that based on our excellent progress, he had been promised a massive promotion, VP of Operations. He said my ability to manage expectations was exactly what the company needed, at the executive level. He even hinted that I could join him in that new tier, with all the stock options and prestige that came with it. That was the turning point. It wasn't just about the work anymore. It was about the sheer audacity of his greed. He was going to climb a ladder made of our exhaustion, built on a foundation of lies that I had carefully constructed for him. He wanted to reward my management skills by pulling me up into the very machine that was crushing us all. I smiled at him, toasted his success with lukewarm sparkling water, and said I couldn't wait to see what the future held. The collapse happened during the final integration phase of Ethelgard. We were about 14 months in. According to my original, padded roadmap, we still had another year of development left. In reality, however, we had actually finished the core functionality months ago. But we hadn't told anyone. We had been moving at a snail's pace, slowly revealing the completed modules one by one. Just enough to keep the client from panicking, but not enough to signal that we were actually ahead of schedule. The plan was to have everything ready for final testing in exactly 6 months. That would bring us to the 18-month mark I had originally told them was needed. It would look like we had worked incredibly hard and hit a perfect, precise deadline. It would make Marcus a god. But there was one variable I hadn't accounted for: the client's new CTO. The new CTO arrived 3 months before our projected launch. He wasn't a suit. He was a veteran engineer who had spent 20 years in the trenches of high-scale systems. Within his first week, he began conducting deep-dive audits of our technical documentation and our development velocity. He didn't just look at the milestones, he looked at the code commits. He looked at how much work was actually being done per sprint compared to what we were reporting in our high-level summaries. He saw through the simulated progress almost immediately. I knew it was coming when I saw him walking toward Marcus's office with a thick folder, followed closely by their legal team. The air in the office changed. The hum of the computers seemed louder, more aggressive. There was no shouting, not at first. It was the quiet kind of disaster. The kind that happens when someone realizes they've been sold a dream that is actually a nightmare. The client realized that we hadn't been working on a massive, complex 18-month build. They realized we had been stalling. They realized that the unforeseen complexities I had used to justify my 6-month padding were non-existent. To them it looked like fraud. It looked like we had taken their milestone payments and sat on our hands while they waited for a product that wasn't actually being built at the pace promised. The fallout was catastrophic. The client pulled the contract immediately and sued NexusStream for breach of contract and misrepresentation. They weren't just looking for their money back. They were looking for damages due to the delay in their own logistics rollout. NexusStream, despite its profitable appearance, didn't have the liquid capital to fight a multi-million-dollar lawsuit from a global giant. Within 3 months, the company was in liquidation. Marcus's promotion evaporated. His VP of Operations title became a joke in the industry. He went from being a rising star to a man who couldn't get an interview at a local startup. The board of directors launched an internal investigation to find out how such a massive discrepancy had occurred between the technical reality and the management reports. They looked at the project leads. They looked at the developers. They looked for the person who had signed off on those inflated estimates. I was sitting in my office, packing up my personal belongings into a small cardboard box, when the HR director came to talk to me. I didn't look guilty. I didn't look scared. I looked tired. "Elias," he said, her voice trembling slightly. "The investigators. They are very confused. They are looking at your logs. You were actually delivering code far ahead of schedule in many areas. But the timelines you provided to Marcus, they don't match the actual work hours recorded by your team. Why did you insist on those 6-month buffers? If we had been honest, we could have managed this." I looked her straight in the eye. I used the same tone I had used with Marcus for a year. "It was all about risk mitigation," I said softly. "As I told Marcus many times, the complexity of the architecture required massive contingency windows. If we hadn't padded those estimates, we wouldn't have been able to guarantee stability. I was protecting the company." She stared at me for a long time. She knew I was lying. The logs showed that my team had actually been working much less than their official hours would suggest. Not because they were lazy, but because the tasks were so overinflated that we finished them easily. But she couldn't prove intent. She could only see a developer who was being unreasonably cautious, in a way that accidentally destroyed the company. They didn't fire me for fraud. They didn't have the evidence to do that. Instead, they let me go as part of the massive layoffs during the liquidation. I walked out of that building with my box and my dignity, leaving a trail of chaos behind me. A few weeks later, I sat in a coffee shop and watched the news on a small TV, mounted in the corner. There was a segment about NexusStream's collapse. Marcus appeared briefly in a grainy shot, looking haggard and gray, being escorted from a meeting by security. He looked like a man who had lost everything. I felt nothing. No joy, no triumph, no anger. Just a profound sense of equilibrium. The scales had been balanced. The most beautiful part was what happened next. Because the investigation concluded that the failures were due to mismanagement and poor oversight of technical timelines, Marcus's reputation was effectively dead in our industry. If you are known as the guy who can't tell the difference between a 2-week task and a 6-month project, you are a liability. No one will hire a man who doesn't understand the reality of what he is selling. As for me, I took a job at a much smaller firm, a tiny startup. They have no layers of management. The CEO is a developer who actually understands how code works. When they asked me about my preferred workflow, I was honest. I told them exactly how long things take. I told them that if we want it done by June, we need to start in February. And because they trust me, I never have to pad anything again. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and my daughter is sleeping, I think about those 6 months I reclaimed for myself. Every hour I spent playing football instead of debugging. Every evening I spent reading a book instead of staring at a monitor in a dark office. Those were my true profits. The company thought they were losing a developer, but really, they just finally paid the bill for what they owed me.